Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space, and I'm happy to be joined here today by Ellen Helsper. We're going to have a conversation about the digital disconnect and what it means for us as researchers. But before we get started, if you are new to Method Space, this is a blog community hosted by Sage Publications. And we're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting, analyzing research, and then writing about it and sharing our results in all different kinds of ways. You can see that at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a student or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn, and hopefully we can learn from one another. So I hope that this interview today will be an opportunity for you to gain some new insights. So Ellen, why don't you start by introducing yourself and then your new book.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, Janet. It's great to be part of this. Yeah, so I just published this new book, which is actually the result of like decades of research now, in some ways depressingly, that we're still talking about these issues. But yeah, so the title of the book is The Digital Disconnect, the Social Causes and Consequences of Digital Inequalities. And it really looks at how over the years, the discussion around the digital inequalities or digital divide, as it was once known, has developed, and how it links to kind of explanations of how these come into being. So kind of that's the social causes of it, but also what the consequences are for everyday practice. And in this case, we're talking about the practice of research. And but most of the research obviously focuses on what it means for the implications for people's everyday lives as societies become increasingly digital. What can we see in terms of who gets to participate, who gets to be heard, who gets to be represented in society? And in this case, we're talking about research, who is in our data, who can participate in our data when we talk about digital societies. Yeah.
Right. And also, I mean, for access to even learning and understanding about these issues, so that we are better citizens, whichever side of the monitor we're on. So maybe you could begin by giving us your definition, talking about your definition of this kind of inequality and how this definition has kind of evolved over time.
Yeah. So, the kind of definition always starts, the kind of basic definition is kind of the kind of digital inclusion is an important term here, is the opportunity and the ability to kind of use ICTs. And in this case, we also focus on deciding not to use ICTs, information and communication technologies, such as the internet. What is important when we talk about inequalities is that there's the systematic differences in these opportunities and abilities. So it's not just whether an individual can use or has the opportunity to connect to all the information and opportunities that are available online, but whether there are systematic differences based on socio-demographic characteristics or vulnerabilities, psychological vulnerabilities, or of those kinds. So that's what we're really looking at, more of these systematic differences. And over the years, we've added to this that it's not just this opportunity and ability to use ICTs or decide not to use them, but it's also the important thing about these is that it's about achieving kind of beneficial outcomes in everyday life, because it's not so much the engagement with the technology that in this case is important in our research when we talk about social and digital inequalities, but really in what the outcomes are of that use for people's everyday well-being. And then we talk not just about the opportunities and the benefits, which has been the focus of a lot of digital inclusion interventions, but also on kind of the risks that come with being online. So also the avoidance of kind of harm or more negative outcomes of the use of technology. And then in recent years, if we look at the definition and how it's developed, it's not just about the harm or the benefits for us as individuals, but for us, for others as well, others like us or others who are not like us. And if we think about when we talk about digital skills in particular, or digital literacy, it's about not just being able to use the technologies that we have right now, but and to be able to engage with them in positive ways, but also in a future society which might be digital, but digital in a very different way. So it's these kind of transferable
Mhm.
skills that we could apply to
Mhm.
any kind of digital society or digital environment and feel comfortable there and make others feel comfortable and be able to reap the benefits and avoid some of the harm that might come
Right,
from this
right.
digitalization. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting because having been involved just in a broad way in thinking about the digital divide, back in the early days of the internet, where, we were really talking about, say, do you have a computer? Do you have access to the computer? Is the computer connected to the internet? Do you have the basic skills to use these tools and navigate? And we weren't thinking so much about the potential for harms that we're now seeing so much of with the misinformation, disinformation, that it seemed like really goes into this. It's not only the ability to use it, but the ability to use these tools in a way that will have a positive outcome,
Mm,
and to be able to discern the difference between valuable information about important things like health and or
mm,
safety issues in your community and that sort of thing, where it's it's
yeah,
really, it's not just a matter of I've got a different idea than you do. it's
yeah.
it's really in
Now, an
some
important
cases life
here,
or death.
obviously, is that these are not equally distributed, right? That it's that some people might be more engaged than others, but that is especially certain people who have been historically disadvantaged, especially who also tend to be like cumulatively disadvantaged in the digital world. If we think about
Hmm.
people who might come from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, they are less likely to get high quality access. If we think about this access kind
Hmm.
of aspect of it, which was called like the first level digital divide or the first level digital inequalities, also as I discussed them in my book. So, but on top of that, they are more less likely to live in environments that, for example, kind of have the kind of tools, but also behaviors of others around them that are kind of motivating them to kind of be able to understand or see the benefits of the use of technology. Or they might have histories in which actually technologies have often been imposed on them and used against them in certain ways in terms of the collection of their data or monitoring their behaviors. And so these two things accumulate. And then if we
Hmm.
think about things like digital skills, which I mentioned before, it's the skill to not just use technologies kind of in a more passive way, in the sense of like, here's a, you give you the skills to know what the buttons do or how this app works or how to
Right,
download it and use it in the way that it was designed, but also the kind of skills, the more social critical skills to
right.
understand why technologies are the way they are, how they might shape us and others in certain ways to behave in certain ways, how we can not just use technology, but actually how our own behaviors and the things that we do shape the way the technologies work for us or against us, or for others or against others. Those skills are also unequally distributed, and that kind of that accumulation of factors kind of creates this intersection of inequalities that
Hmm.
when technologies are just introduced without kind of a conscious or the right kind of design around it, of interventions or the technological design or bottom up kind of thinking about who is involved in the construction of information, as you mentioned, or just content online, that we can see that there's kind of an amplification of inequalities that already existed, where the people who
Right.
already had stuff, whether it's social capital or cultural capital or economic capital, these
Right.
kinds of things that we talk about in research, like they tend to amplify these inequalities that already existed. And there's ways of doing that, and I'm being conscious of this kind of unequal distribution of participation and creation of content online that can then mitigate this. But if we are not aware of that, that often leads to kind of all kinds of problems in terms of who is represented and who is able to participate in decision-making processes, who is able to get health outcomes, who, as you mentioned, who's going to be better informed or worse informed, and
Mhm.
therefore has the tools to participate in this knowledge society. So that accumulation and that kind of sequentiality of amplification of inequalities is often invisible because we focus on, individuals with certain skills or
Mhm.
quantitative indicators of participation rather than the actual quality of engagement and these outcomes that we were just talking about.
Right, right. So
Yeah,
finish this
and you
definition
have the
here.
full definition
Right.
right there.
Yeah, I think
And
that's a really y- perhaps just more important than ever to think about in terms of avoiding negative outcomes, because we're certainly seeing a lot of that, people being manipulated and taken advantage of, whether it's financially or politically or health wise, because they just are not able to really evaluate the information that they're receiving. And we certainly have, kind of the old fashioned digital divide hasn't gone away either. I mean, even, I'm based in the United States, and I mean, there are parts of the United States where uh, broadband is really hard to get. And, when I'm in if I'm visiting or traveling, I'll think, well, I remember back in the old days, because I'm old enough to remember the early days of the internet, where a lot of times, like apps or sites would give you an option. You could have a low bandwidth option, because back then they assumed, I mean, some people are at universities with fast connections, and some people are, over the telephone line with their modem, ding, 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 clicking you in this, but it's very slow. And they don't offer that anymore. And there's so much visual content and media that takes so long to download, so that if you're somebody who is in a place where you don't have access to that kind of broadband, you're really at a disadvantage, because it's hard to just get to the
for
information.
sure.
So it seems like there's just a lot
Yeah,
to unpack
it's really the
around this
infrastructure
topic.
still is important. Yeah. And not to forget that if we think about, for example, in the education space, right, or learning space, or the kind of contributing space rather than more passive engagement with content that is downloaded. If we think about the difference between somebody who only has a mobile phone, maybe not even with a data plan, but who has to connect to Wi-Fi whenever it's available, because that's
Mhm.
kind of what their resources can afford. Is that like, imagine having to write an essay or to kind of like do kind of more complicated things. Just having a mobile phone that is not able to connect in the ways that a more sophisticated high-end mobile phone might
Right,
be. It's really hard to participate, like uploading your homework or doing your homework, or
right.
if we think about writing a CV and uploading that and making it snazzy, like the mobile phone in combination with other tools, uh, like is a very handy and very kind of useful tool to
Mhm.
add to what you already have. But there's a lot of people who just depend on that mobile phone, and they often also live on kind of areas or regions, or in this case in the United States, where the connections are not as good and where there's not as much,
Mm.
where you can't connect to these high-speed networks with 4G and stuff like that. So that basic level definitely is essential, like the kind of, without good infrastructure we are not going to see participation in ways
Right,
that are equal in the ways that some of the techno optimists might have hoped when this came into being, because the
right,
technology continues to evolve, and even if you now have a much better phone that you had 5 years ago, your connection might still not be
right,
at the same level. Yeah.
right. I think, I mean, there's kind of a shift from thinking, well, people would have, say, a family computer at home, to thinking, oh, well, everybody can just have a phone. And then, certainly I think during the pandemic, when, the pressure has been on that, the limitations of that are becoming more apparent, as you described. So I want to think, a little bit about, what these points mean for for researchers who are thinking about collecting data online, or even thinking about, teaching and learning research skills online, etc. Maybe you could speak about, these ideas, as they would be particularly relevant to researchers.
Yeah, I think first point I would make, we've talked about access and these kind of motivation and these inequalities, which are very strongly linked to socioeconomic disadvantage, right? It's really hard to get high quality access if you kind of live in a more economically deprived area or come from a family without a lot of economic resources. So that's the first point, that we need to think about when you go online, who is most likely to be able to, contribute, or who you most likely to be able to find in these spaces, whether it's because there's data about these people there, or because you are trying to find interview subjects or survey research subjects. So that's I think the first step, and I think this is something that people are relatively aware of. Like when people think about digital inequalities or digital inclusion or digital divides, this kind of access aspect is there, and so there's all kinds of ways in which people try to reach people who don't have that kind of access. It's about coverage, really, if we think about it. So you try to figure out, okay, where are people who might not have access? Maybe we'll use offline methods to kind of do this kind of research. What people are sometimes less aware of as researchers is that because of this unequal distribution of skills, like the people who engage intensely tend to be the people who have these kinds of educational resources, people with higher levels of education, people who live in environments like neighborhoods or regions or cities or villages where there is quite a lot of infrastructure, where they see a lot of people around them using technology in many ways, many people around them who are like them. So that's the kind of motivation aspect of it, right? Where you kind of motivated to engage. You hear people, they have support networks who tell them, hey, go there, oh, I saw this thing on Twitter, I saw this thing on YouTube, or they comment on it, right? So that's kind of, I think, important to understand, that it's not just about finding people through access and technology, but also through having higher levels of skills, which are associated with these other factors. Might actually be another reason why certain people are less likely to participate if you're doing digital research through digital tools and digital environments, right? So then again, we sometimes start to think, if you think about sampling and trying to represent a representative sample, you might get, men and women, you might get people from a lot of different backgrounds, like social cultural backgrounds, but they tend to be people who have higher levels of education or are really kind of engaged, in a technological sense, where they live in these environments that are quite tech savvy, even if they, based on their characteristics, you might consider them excluded. So we really need to look at, understand that the people who generate data. So that's a matter of kind of, let's say, more technical skills and technical kind of, you can observe where these people live and where they come from through some techniques that we have. What is more difficult to discern and more difficult to tackle as well is that because in the digital space, we might do research with human subjects where we can figure out who's participating in our research and who therefore is missing. But you can also do analysis of content that is online. Right. And so in both these circumstances, in both these scenarios, whether you analyze the content that's online, let's say on social media, or on kind of, user-generated content platforms where people upload their content, is that what we see there is that there's a kind of a different kind of inequality that might be less obvious. So we might see a lot of content produced around certain topics, or a lot of participation, like quantitatively, many people are participating in that space. But then if we see which content is the most popular, or which gets reacted to in the most positive way, or which gets the most, kind of forwards or links from other sites, we often see that that's content that's produced, first of all, by people who are already kind of more, whose ideas or views of the world or experiences correspond more with what we might call the norm, or the dominant norm, or the kind of thing like that, because it kind of corresponds with what we would, what we like to find. That's the way the world is created. because that's kind of abstract language. Let me try to illustrate it with a kind of an example of YouTube, for example. A few years ago, there was like some research that was done where like like say the top 40 YouTubers, 43% of those were, or 43 of them, top 40. So 34 of them, let's say, were men. Yeah, the people who were liked the most. And then, there were also a few women represented there amongst the most popular vloggers. What the men subjects covered was a lot of variety of areas, right? Hobbies, do it yourself, new kind of all kinds of different types of subjects, while the women who were popular were actually more likely to do what, let's call it, stereotypical women's topics, in the sense of that there were like more beauty vloggers. There was like one or two who talked about other subjects, but it was much less likely that that content got pushed to the top, right? The same and so what we see in these kinds of public spaces, the kind of data that we have access to that is public, is that it often represents the content that we are most comfortable with certain people producing when they come from certain backgrounds, and people who are in those spaces don't see themselves represented, or that's the other aspect, the second aspect of this, or when they do try to participate, let's say on social media, they are more likely to be harassed or bullied, or when they come from certain backgrounds. So all this leads to people seeing that and retracting from these public spaces. It's not that they disappear from the internet. Sometimes they go into safe spaces where they have discussions. We talked about misinformation. I'll come back to that in 1 second. But like people will go into these safe spaces, they will still be exposed and, in the public platforms to these kind of more normative and the more kind of acceptable in some ways, as society on the whole perceives them, types of content. But the majority and the public data that's available will not be exposed to the discussions people are having in these safe spaces. And so this is not to say that the people need to go on public spaces to be harassed because they need to represent themselves and make sure that their views are heard, but it's something that we need to be aware of as researchers, like what kind of data do we have access to, and how can we make sure that we represent all these voices, right? And then, so there's a lot of talk about echo chambers and filter bubbles and things like that. And what we actually see, our research is kind of showing more and more, is that these echo chambers or filter bubbles exist more for kind of the elite than they do for people who are vulnerable, because of the process that I just described. Because on the public platforms, where people who are confident historically have come from groups who've been heard, who have power, they talk a lot and they don't see experiences or kind of, that are more marginal. And so when we talk about misinformation and things like conspiracy theories or stuff like that, we see that these people come into these spaces, they know that they don't feel that represented, and then they go into these other spaces where they feel heard, where people tell them things that correspond with their worldview, that make them feel part of it. So when we do research, we need to be very, very careful in, to not confuse quantity with kind of diversity of information. And so we need to really start almost from the people that we want to include and the voices that we want to include, and understand where they are and go to those spaces, rather than taking the kind of public face of the internet as the thing that represents what people are talking about. And we've seen in the past, right, that conclusions can go very badly wrong if we use data that's just publicly available, that people might not represent really what's going on in society.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned a moment ago about, also the kind of caveats about, going into perhaps, those kinds of conversations, discussion groups that might be, where there's a question, is this public or is this private? And, what those, what those decisions mean in terms of collecting data, particularly when we're collecting data from people who are not consenting participants.
Yeah. And this is one of the most contentious debates that had. The Association of Internet Researchers has been developing these ethics guidelines for doing online research for a very long time. It's also something that differs a lot between institutions in terms of the requirements that they put upon researchers to get consent, for example, from the people that have published information or content online to analyze this, or to contact people. And the reason why it's ethically contentious is, again, going back to this kind of model of all these different aspects of digital inequalities, is that, first of all, just because somebody's put something on a public platform doesn't mean that they understood that this was public or that they gave consent for it to be researched, right? And it's difficult to, because sometimes we draw parallels with the offline world. It's like, well, if somebody goes and sends on a public square and shouts, this is my opinion about X, and there's a researcher there who's observing the square, you don't necessarily have to ask for consent because it's understood that this person is, doing this in a public space. Although even that could be contested, you could still go to that person and ask, I'm doing this research project, is it okay? But often people don't realize when they are in these semi-public spaces, or they don't have this literacy to understand that they need to click this so that only their friends can see them, or they don't understand the consequences of having public information published. That's on top of that, in the internet, is permanent in many, many ways. It's really hard to get rid of, right? So even if you consent in that moment, it's like the terms and conditions that we might consent to. If we've read them, we might consent to them in the moment, but then the platform goes and changes them, and we don't read them anymore, right? So, and so even on these public platforms, it's really hard because there's a lot of people who don't have these kinds of literacy and skills, and because, as we talked about, they're unequally distributed, it's much more likely that more vulnerable people that we would normally really have to write ethics kind of approval forms for are more likely to give that kind of data that might have negative consequences for them, or that they don't understand the consequences of when they publish it. They're more likely to post it, right? The other aspect of this is that often researchers kind of conveniently think that something is a public password, a public platform, even though you have to log in, right? There's a login, and most people are there, or in chat groups or something like that. And people have become more savvy of creating groups and spaces, but because things get scraped and archived and things like that, and sometimes these things get out, or you get an invitation, you're part of a group, you've been observing things, you think, okay, this was shared, and so I will use it for my research. But in offline situations in the past, we would have announced that we were researchers and doing that kind of things. Many institutions now do have ethics guidelines that say that if you're in spaces that require a login, where there's no agreement in advance that what we do on this platform might be shared with researchers, that's like a bare minimum where you have to ask for consent and ethics. And also on public platforms, to a third point, if we're talking about social media in this case, there's also a difference between the public information, and the ethics guidelines are very different. But if it's somebody let's say a younger person, or if it's if it's a person from a vulnerable background, whether it's psychologically vulnerable or vulnerable in another way, where it's a private citizen on this public platform, and because we can actually reach out to these people because they are in these digital spaces, I would say the default should be try to reach out to these individuals and see, explain to them, ask for consent, as we would do in any other kind of research project. The other thing about anonymization, this is something that happens a lot with content analysis of this kind of material, is that one of the things is that digital information is very easily searchable. So you might anonymize the person, as we do as good researchers when we don't want to make sure that there's no harm for participants, or that they don't that they're don't get identified as individuals. And then we use, for example, full quotes from whatever they posted or tweeted or something like that. And while anonymization in the offline, non-digital part would be enough, online this is not enough because you can
Right.
easily kind of just copy paste and look for it if it's archived. I think the last thing I would say about ethics, because we've talked a lot about ethics of the kind of people that might be have produced content online or who are
Mhm.
participating in this space. But the ethics also always includes the researcher's own safety and vulnerability in these online spaces. And a lot of the conversations I have with students and with other researchers, I'm also the convener of our methods course at the London School of Economics in our media and communications department. And one of the things we now end up talking a lot to students about is that their presence online, people who are participating in their research, they
Mhm.
put themselves out there before they even start doing this research project. And they are more at risk of harm too, often in these circumstances.
Mhm.
Like it's now very, very common that research participants that you might have invited for a traditional interview have gone online and looked you up. And then if you're trying to study controversial, let's say political opinions or other kinds of opinions,
Mhm.
or you're trying to engage with these groups, they will look you up. And this is really hard to deal with, like, and you need to be very careful about your own profile and managing your own
Right.
information to make sure that as a researcher also, people will not be able to dox you, as it's called, like get your public information online. It's a very complicated kind of space that we're doing research in from both sides, both of us as individual researchers and for the people, the humans behind the content that's produced,
Right.
let's say. Yeah.
Right. So, it seems to me like, there's so much important thinking in your book. Maybe you could talk a little bit about who might benefit from this book besides, or in addition to, say, adoption as a
Mm.
text in courses. But would seem to me this would be very useful for researchers who are, in the field and, just even if you are a recent graduate and had the opportunity to study these kinds of issues when you were in college or university, it's changing so much that
Yeah,
you
no,
might
it's
stay up
continuously
to date.
changing. Yeah. But it's continuously changing. But I would think also there's some, it's not just because it's digital or because there's a new technology. Everything has changed, and we need new theories and new methods. I think there's a lot of the things that explains why people might participate in discussions or in research that actually are relatively similar. Or thinking about our own reflexivity, our position as a researcher, and how that might influence who we approach, or the language that we use, or the kind of questions that we ask. These things are, or how people react to us as researchers, these things are not that different in the digital space, but we need to make sure that we are aware that they are still there, even if we're in this virtual platform. So the book was kind of also intentionally written not just for, as a handbook for students to learn about the phenomenon, but also indeed for researchers to understand how to research and to how to do research in these increasingly digital spaces. And there, I think it's important to understand that just because we're studying something that might be digital or that might be taking place in a digital space, that the methods don't necessarily have to be digital. Yeah, if we want to know what people um, think about technologies or about the relationships that we're having or about misinformation, a lot of methods that we've been using in the past, like in-depth interviewing or large-scale survey research, sometimes using really good design, or actually often using really good design that's based on offline sampling and stuff like that, will get at people's engagement with technology. So that's the first point that I would be making here. One of the things I think that is interesting that's coming out of this kind of research in digital spaces as tools for researchers is that what we often see is that there's a lot of methodological individualism, in the sense of that a lot of these phenomena are studied from the individual, the skills that they have, their particular identity and how they react, or these kind of more structural universalism that is like,
Mhm.
all women or all men, or
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
And what we see from this kind of research that is now taking place is that actually it's going more to this meso level of where we realize that it's in our everyday actions that really explains how people engage with information and content and things like that. So we see a kind of a shift, at least in my own work, but also in that of my colleagues, I can see this, is that we are starting to study more and more kind of environments in which people and technology come together. So like cities and neighborhoods, kind of the networks, both online and offline, the relationships and how information circulates there. And schools, that requires different methodological tools. And that also requires different ethical guidelines, right? It's not about your relationship with an individual, for example, or an individual piece of content, but how that's linked to or gives us access to other people's lives and other people's thoughts and content. So I think for researchers, that's one of the things that in the book, it kind of ends on that, to think about, don't think about it in that either individualistic way or that kind of superstructural way, because actually that meso level is giving lots of rich data, and we need to kind of incorporate those things. But obviously policymakers, I do a lot of work with policymakers, governments, but also in the third sector, people who work with, social services, or who support vulnerable groups, who work with discriminated groups and things like that. We do a lot of work because it's becoming clearer and clearer that you cannot implement health interventions or educational interventions, or take action against discrimination and racism and sexism and things like that, without considering how the digital spaces or the digitization of society amplifies these. And so the book kind of tries to bring those two fields together, because there's also a lot of knowledge about these processes historically, like why do people bully others? Why do people harass others? Why do people participate in political processes in certain ways that are also still relevant and valid in these digital spaces? But that knowledge has to come together. So that's one of the things that the book tries to do as well. And then there's another aspect of my work that is a lot around children and young people and their parents, growing up and learning how to live in the digital space. So there's also, I think, some value to be had. I hope that the language is accessible enough for people to say, okay, like for my own everyday life, my family, my, kind of the world I live in, what are the things that I need to be aware of and take into consideration for my family and the people that live around me? How can we create together, kind of better digital future? Yeah.
Right. And, the importance of just understanding the context in a much more in-depth way, rather than simply thinking, oh, well, gee, I'm studying X and here's a Facebook group that is discussing X, problem solved, here's my data. That it's a little bit more complicated than that. And we really need to give some thought to, the bigger picture, and how those kind of representations online fit with where the person is coming from, or whether they're even posting, say, their honest perspectives, or are just, kind of joining in a conversation. So, well, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think as well as researchers, and I think coming back to a kind of a classic ethnographic principle, is that, and in the digital space more than even than the offline space, is that we are not removed from the research, like you said. We're not going in and researching something that other people are doing, but in the digital space, every action, every click, every comment that we make, every group that we enter, every kind of thing that we do as researchers, as individuals, shapes that world that we are interacting with. And that in that sense, it's a little bit different from the offline world, where if I open a door, the door doesn't become smaller or bigger for the next researcher, right? But if as a researcher, I tend to go into communities, or I click on certain links, or I download certain content constantly, that gives a sign that because of algorithms and things like that is content that's valued, that's content that's accessible, and the door in the digital space becomes bigger, and another door, which I might not have seen or might not have been presented to me, becomes smaller. And so we need to be aware, that when we click or talk to certain people and not to other people, that these people become and these contents become more prominent, as researchers. And so we need to kind of be aware of that. That's a digital skill that everybody needs to have in this society, kind of an
Right,
awareness
right.
of how we shape that digital space. But as researchers, we are part shaping the world that we're studying every time we go into that digital space.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this is helpful to people who are thinking about doing research, either online or uh, using technology in some way especially in the data collection stage. So, thank you for sharing that with us.